A month later, just before the Italian Grand Prix, the FIA announced publicly that they had new evidence in the Spygate saga. The case had been reopened and a date set for a new hearing in Paris, which just so happened to coincide with Thursday of the Belgian Grand Prix. Welcome back, folks, to another Tales from the Treehouse, and you will have guessed, obviously, from that I'm talking today about Spygate. Now, this is a subject that was so huge it took up an entire chapter of this book. So if you want to know more about what I'm talking about today, go ahead and check this out. It has some interesting details I think you'll find. What I've decided to do today is pick one specific moment from that whole Spygate saga, and I could have gone on for days and days, but I've decided to pick the day of that hearing in Paris, where we were all at the Belgian Grand Prix, and what it felt like from inside that McLaren garage. Now there was genuine concern amongst the team. We hadn't known the scale of the infiltration of the Ferrari documents and their information until that point. Our own internal investigation had been kept within a pretty small circle, and Ron had told everybody the same thing. The stolen documents had never entered the McLaren factory, and we had no reason to disbelieve him. And in this whole Spygate saga, you have to appreciate that from people at my level within the team, in fact, people from pretty much every level in the team, outside of a very small circle of people at the very top, in the very small group of core design people, and a couple of our drivers, people weren't even aware of this. Now, I had absolutely no idea till this story broke in the news, but as it started to gather momentum, things became more and more serious, in that people like me, the general people working on the shop floor, if you like, behind the scenes at every Formula One race, behind the scenes in this great big team at the very front of this public-facing affair. For people like me, I was starting to worry about things like my job. Were we going to be thrown out of the championship? Was this going to be so serious that I might be out of a job and looking for something to do in just a couple of weeks' time? Italy had been a really strange race, in that this case had been reopened. It all come off the back of, if you remember, Fernando disclosing that information to Bernie Ecclestone and then Max Mosley. The story's bubbling up in the media, and it actually became quite a ferocious story between Ferrari and ourselves, particularly as we were in Italy at the time. It was a really uncomfortable situation. So when we got to 2 weeks later at that Belgian Grand Prix, on the Thursday, the day of the hearing, it was a really weird atmosphere amongst the team. There was a nervous tension in the garage on Thursday as we made final preparations for the cars. Lewis was in Paris to give evidence with Ron, Paddy Lowe and the legal team, and their unusual absence in our garage made for an eerie vibe. We tried as best we could to stay focused on the job, but every time we set foot outside the garage doors, someone would ask us about the situation. And I definitely remember that. There's no exaggeration. It was a really uncomfortable, weird and eerie time, an atmosphere around the place. Not only that the entire paddock was talking about it, and when we did step outside the back of the garage for a break or to walk over to the motorhome, invariably either one of our friends from another team or sometimes even journalists would stop and doorstep us and try to get questions, even though they weren't really permitted to speak to members of the team outside of the media department. We were being asked for information or for little inside snippets or what the feeling was like in the team. Our colleagues at other teams were asking us what we thought was going to happen, what we knew about it all, what was going on. The truth is we didn't know. But even inside our own garage, it was impossible not to be thinking of this really serious threat that was hanging over us all. Dave Ryan, the team manager, had called a meeting for that morning to brief us all as best he could. The message was hardly groundbreaking. We were all to continue as if we were going racing. There was no news from Paris, and we had no idea how long the hearing would take. We didn't even know if there would definitely be a decision, or more specifically, even a sentencing that particular day. The verdict, though, was surely a formality. We were guilty. The sentence, however, could literally be the difference between keeping my house or not. And that is how serious it felt. And the point was that we were guilty because the information from Ferrari had undoubtedly come into our team and been disseminated amongst a number of people. Nothing that I had anything to do with, of course, that most people had anything to do with, of course, but there was no way we could possibly claim that, in terms of a breach of the rules, we weren't guilty. We knew that. So now it was all about how serious the FIA saw this. We knew that Max Mosley and Ron Dennis, well, they didn't get on. Let's be honest, they hated each other. And Max had been looking for a reason to get back at Ron for some time. Was this going to be it? Was this going to be the thing that he really threw the book at us for? By early that evening, the garage, the 2 race cars and my T-car were finished and ready for FP1 on Friday morning. And with huge uncertainty hanging like a black cloud over us, we left the circuit and headed back to our hotel for dinner. And I do remember driving away from the circuit that day, not even knowing if we'd be coming back to turn a wheel with the cars, or whether we'd just be coming back to pack things up. But I remember getting halfway back and thinking about the meeting that we'd had earlier with Dave Ryan, where he said, look, Ron had specifically asked him to hold that meeting. He'd called from Paris to say, look, get the team together and tell them not to worry. And I remember thinking, how on earth can Ron say not to worry in all of this? I mean, I think Ron's words were, look, if we get thrown out of the Formula One World Championship, we'll just go and do IndyCar racing. I remember him saying that, thinking, I mean, thanks Ron, but that's ridiculous. What are we all going to do, move to America? So we were worried, we were concerned, and driving back from the circuit back to the hotel was a weird mix of long periods of silence in our car, in our hire car, in a minibus, and then mixed in with somebody trying to break that silence with a light-hearted joke about it or whatever, which people would falsely laugh at for a moment and then go back to the silence when we were all kind of mulling over in our minds what the outcome could be, what was going on. Halfway back in the car, my phone rang and Dave Ryan's phone number flashed up on the screen. The car fell silent in anticipation of news. We're expecting an announcement soon, said Dave, somewhat anticlimactically. Ron would like us all to be here together when it comes, so could you please turn around and head back to the circuit? So before we'd even got back to the hotel, we were turning around without much to go on and heading back into the racetrack. Well, you can imagine now, given that we've got a tiny bit of news but not really much, and we're all heading back into the race circuit to find out our fate, to find out our future, much more so than just the future of that weekend, but the future of our championship and our jobs and our livelihoods and everything else that goes along with that. After doing that U-turn and heading back in, the tension that was already pretty high went up 4 or 5 notches. Back at the circuit, it was a sombre scene, almost deserted. There was a bleak mood inside our garage too. All the roller doors were down, just a few lights remained on and the cars were under their covers. I'd had a similar feeling waiting outside the school headmaster's study as a teenager, my parents inside, after being apprehended for selling cans of beer to first and second year students. Back then there was no question that I was guilty. I'd been caught red-handed. All that was left was to discover my fate at the hands of a terrifyingly strict and vindictive man in power. The 2 situations felt remarkably similar. That's a whole other story, which I won't go into today. But that's what it felt like. It felt like I'd been caught. It felt like I was guilty. Even though I hadn't done anything wrong, I was associated now with a team that was undeniably guilty in one of the worst espionage crimes in Formula One recent history, maybe in all Formula One history. We waited and waited and waited. For over 2 hours, we sat on tool cabinets, boxes, race tyres and on the floor, propped up against walls. The McLaren garage had never looked so untidy. Now able to plug my laptop in, I was constantly refreshing the Autosport website pages looking for info, as did everybody else. And, you know, there was no Twitter, there was no Instagram, there was no social media to speak of back then. So it was a case of getting onto Autosport, which is our primary source of information at the time. You know, despite waiting for a phone call from Ron Dennis at the scene, you know, whilst we were waiting for that call to come through with some sort of news, we kept refreshing the Autosport page. And I remember literally every few seconds refreshing the page, and then a story would pop up in a Google search of Spygate, for example. And it would be some rogue story about somebody speculating that we'd been chucked out the championship or that we'd been banned for life or whatever. Some horrific stories coming up. People seeing them and getting concerned, and somebody going, look, have you seen this? And realising that, you know, it wasn't concrete fact. We needed to stay calm until we got some concrete fact, because up until then it was literally speculation, and some people were wild in that speculation. But then after a period of time, Dave Ryan's phone rang. Everyone stopped talking and stared up at him, wide-eyed like baby birds in a nest, looking up at their mother, hoping for food. It was Ron. But we didn't need Ron for news, because seconds into the call, with me still blindly refreshing the laptop, now habitually, compulsively, Autosport broke the real story. The first thing to hit home was that we would be racing that weekend, which ultimately meant I was keeping my job. The relief was immense. And it was. That was the first thing, that we would be racing in Spa that weekend. We weren't going to be packing things away that night and flying home. And yes, that meant I was keeping my job. And you can imagine the knock-on effects of all that. The being able to pay the mortgage, being able to pay and look after my family, and all of those things that come with the sudden loss of an income. That was the first sense of relief that hit me. But then, of course, there was some bad news too. $100 million fine, a ridiculous figure I couldn't even begin to get my head around, was to be imposed on the team. But in the end, that wouldn't be my direct problem. That was one for Ron to work out. More damaging, though, was our expulsion from that year's Constructors or Teams Championship. That really hurt. And when I say that really hurt, that still hurts today. Because you have to understand that the people in that garage, and particularly for me that year, I wasn't directly associated with one car or the other, with Lewis or Fernando. I was in charge of the T car in 2007, which was the third car that we used to bring to the racetrack. So I had no association to one or the other. So the biggest goal for me was, we wanted to win races every weekend, but I wanted to win that Constructors' Championship. That would have meant the world to me, to my colleagues in a similar situation, to the hundreds and hundreds of people back at the factory in Woking. The Constructors' Championship was the one that we all wanted to win. And in a flash, like that, through no fault of our own, when we'd created a car and a team that was so ready to win that championship that year, we'd had it taken away. And after a couple of days of trying to allow that to sink in, which eventually it kind of did, although not fully really until probably weeks later, that hurt and that disappointment turned to anger. World titles are indescribably difficult things to win. The opportunity simply doesn't come around very often. And after finally becoming an F1 mechanic, and after years of dedication and trying, that world title was my dream. It was a difficult moment as Dave put the phone down and confirmed what we by now already knew. For Lewis and Fernando's crews, actually it was a great result. Their drivers had escaped any punishment in exchange for assisting the FIA with its inquiries, and their intense title fight continued. They were laughing and joking around the garage like it was completely insignificant as a result to them. Perhaps having been in their shoes with Kimi coming so close to winning in 2003 and 2005, I could understand it. I'm sure I'd have been the same. But perhaps because of my previous experiences, I realised how rare and treasured opportunities like the one just taken from us were. I was not happy. I was not laughing and joking with the boys that night, but cut a forlorn figure as we slipped away into the darkness and back to the hotel once again. And that's kind of how it ended. We went on through the weekend and bumbled through it, and I don't think it was a particularly successful weekend. Nobody was really on their A game, if I'm really honest. And what transpired since then, even up to this point today, was the anger that I developed, was not necessarily with my team as a whole. It wasn't even with the FIA. It wasn't even with Max Mosley. The anger that I had on that particular, or coming out of that particular event, actually was with the people directly involved. It was with Mike Coughlin, a senior designer at our team, a guy that I worked with on a regular basis, that I interacted with weekly. We joked, we laughed, we had fun together, we worked hard together, we worked well together. And yet his actions that led to this whole thing, together with others of course, Nigel Stepney at Ferrari and others who were involved in this, but Mike Coughlin at the very centre of this, had taken away my opportunity that actually, as it happened, only came round once in all of my 10 years to win that Constructors' World Championship. And in that year, it was hands down ours. We were walking away with it. We'd have wrapped it up really early. And as it turned out, having had that taken away from us in a moment, Ferrari, with no fight on their hands from us, went on to wrap that title up that year very, very early. And all of those things started to trigger every time a really deep anger inside me that was very much focused at Mike. And it took me a long time to get over that. And as you can probably guess, I'm probably still not completely over it, because, as I say, those are the moments that you work towards as a competitor, whether you're a sportsman, whether you're an engineer. Those moments, winning the ultimate goal, are what it's all about. And whilst we did our bit, we did everything necessary to win a championship that year, one person in our team, primarily, let us down so severely, so deliberately, so underhandedly, that it's a really hard thing to get your head around. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. That stirred up some emotion for me, that one. I hope it has for you too. But if you want to know more, because the Spygate story, of course, is much further ranging than that, much wider ranging, has so many facets to it, and they affected us all in so many different ways, and there's some really interesting sides to that, I think, in the book. So if you're interested, of course, there's a link in the description. You can go and check it out. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and as ever, I'd love to know more of your suggestions, as this one was a suggestion by many people of stories from the history of Formula One that I may have been involved with, that I might be able to bring you up to the treehouse and talk you through. For now though, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you soon. Ta-ra.